The sport of rock climbing has been shaped by many legends throughout the years, men and women seeking glory on some of the toughest rock faces around the world. And amongst all of these prominent figures, one man stands alone. A man who pushed the grades of sport climbing further than anyone who came before him, and further than anyone ever will again. But before we can talk about that, we have to understand the history of sport climbing grades. Now this may come as a surprise to most of you, but rock climbing wasn't always fun and games. You see, before the 1980s, most climbing was exclusively trad climbing. If you think you have it bad now, imagine only being able to trad climb. This era is mainly known as the pre-sport era, before rock climbing was fun. And the first ever graded climb, according to Wikipedia, was Don Willen's Send of Goliath 511D in 1958. Although the first official consensus 511D would be Fuchs, which was sent by John Stannard in 1967. Although both of these sends were overshadowed by John Gill's send of Thimble in 1961, which would become the first 512A in history. Now I could do an entire video on John Gill, the man is an absolute legend, but for the purposes of this video, I just want to point out the fact that this first ascent, the first 512A in history, was a free solo. As far as I'm aware of, this is the only time in rock climbing history where someone pushed a new grade with a free solo. John, if you're watching this, you're an absolute mad lad. But John, Don, and John would all be cast aside when the first 512B was sent in 1970 by John Gosling. But while John believed he had defeated John, this send wouldn't actually be the first consensus 512B in history. That title actually went to a man named John Bragg in 1973 for his ascent of Kansas City 512B, which is in New York. A few years later in 1975, another 512B would be sent called Hotline in Yosemite, and this legendary climb was sent by the iconic duo Ron Koch and John Bakar. And while Johns, Dons, and Rons around the world rejoiced, they would soon fall silent as the world's first 512C was sent in 1974. John, Ron, John, Don, and, who could forget, John, all watched in awe as Paisano Overhang in Suicide Rock was sent by a man named John Long. This was a massive achievement, and John secured his place in history alongside other grade climbers like John, Ron, Don, and John. But this wouldn't last long, as only 1 year later in 1975, the world's first 512D was sent in El Dorado. The climb was Psycho Roof, and the man who sent it was Steve Wunsch. Damn it, Steve. Steve had officially ended the John era, and over the next few years as the pre-sport era would come to an end, we saw the first ever 513A, the Phoenix, sent by Ray Jardine, and the first 513B, Grand Illusion, sent by Tony Yaniro. But in the early 1980s, as the sport climbing era began, a dark figure was lurking in the shadows. A young man showed up to Lake Tahoe in 1982 and repeated Grand Illusion, and while no one knew his name at the time, the whole world would soon come to learn the name Wolfgang Gulich. But before we get into the man, the myth, the legend, I have to ask you guys a question. How well hung are you? I used to be one of those guys, right? That had a hangboard just drilled, hammered into my wall, right? Nails hanging out, rusty pieces of metal, and it just wasn't very well hung, right? And I would have people come over, right? And they would see my hangboard and they'd be like,
that is not a very well hung hangboard. The climber must also not be very well hung.
I was humiliated, but that's where fictitious hangboards came to save the day. These hangboards are so well hung, you can hang them anywhere. These hangboards come with a doorway mount, so you never have to drill a hole in your drywall again. Hang them up, take them down, put them on a doorway, put them on a wall, put them in the bathroom for all I care. Because everyone knows the age-old saying, if the hangboard ain't well hung, neither is the climber. And I used to be just like you, okay, struggling to hang on my hangboard because I wasn't getting enough hangboard training in because I just wasn't well hung enough and I didn't have that well hung hangboard, but I got the fictitious hangboard. They have two different options for two different hangboards. You can get the monolith or the base model, I don't remember what it's called. Put it on your doorway mount and you get 20% off any hangboard of your choice if you buy a doorway mount. Get yourself a fictitious hangboard and doorway mount, hang it up, start hangboarding, start getting well hung, start climbing better. Fictitious hangboards, a well hung board for a well hung climber. Now let's talk about the greatest era in rock climbing history, the Wolfgang era. Besides having the coolest name in the history of first names, Wolfgang was also a gifted climber. Born in West Germany in 1960, Wolfgang began climbing at 13 years old, and by the time he was 16, he was a well-known climber in Germany. But it wasn't until 1982, when Wolfgang traveled to the United States, that he would gain international fame. In one trip, Wolfgang sent Equinox 513A, Grand Illusion 513B, the hardest grade in the world at the time, and Cosmic Debris, another 513B. To give a modern day equivalent on how crazy this was, imagine if some random unknown climber went to Norway and sent Project Big, Silence, and Change in one trip, and his name was John. Nevertheless, everyone knew who Wolfgang Gulich was now, but despite his accomplishments, he still had yet to set a new grade, and he would miss his chance when his friend Jerry Moffat would send the Face, the world's first 513C, in Wolfgang's home country of Germany. While Wolfgang was no doubt happy for his friend, this would mark the beginning of the greatest spree of sends in climbing history. 1984, Frankenjura, Germany. Wolfgang sends Kanal im Rücken, the world's first 513D. The world rejoices. Wolfgang finally cemented his name into climbing history alongside other great names like John. But he's not done yet, because only 1 year later in 1985, he sends Punks in the Gym, the world's first official 514A. In the span of 1 year, Wolfgang established 2 new grades in sport climbing, being the first person to ever do so. 1 year later in 1986, Wolfgang free solos Separate Reality, capturing one of the most iconic photos in rock climbing history. Problem was, Separate Reality is only 511D, so Wolfgang said fuck that, and that same year, free soloed Weed Killer, a 512D. This was now the hardest free solo ever completed. But Wolfgang still wasn't done yet. After sending Weed Killer, he immediately moved on to Master's Edge 512D. But this is where things took a turn for the worst. Because while climbing the iconic route, Wolfgang fell. And despite having protective gear placed, the fall was still severe enough to break his back. A broken back. Wow. I mean, you don't recover from that, right? I mean, sure, you can heal up, you can get back out there and start climbing again, but will you ever be able to climb hard enough to establish a new grade? Yes. Only 1 year later in 1987, Wolfgang would send Wall Street, the world's first 514B. He was now the first person to establish 3 new grades in sport climbing, and also the first to do so with a broken spine. This man was truly unstoppable, although I imagine it's hard to have a name like Wolfgang and not be a badass. That's like being named Karen and not being a menace to society. Okay, Karen. Okay, Wolfgang had most certainly proved himself in the sport climbing world, and now it was time for him to set his sights on a new challenge: big wall climbing. Over the next 4 years, Wolfgang would send Yugoslavian Route and Trango Towers, as well as Eternal Flame and Riders on the Storm, both of which were first ascents. During Wolfgang's break from sport climbing, his friend Jerry Moffat would send Liquid Amber in 1990. This would be the world's first 514C, and Jerry's second time establishing a new grade. And while it seemed that Wolfgang couldn't possibly accomplish much more, 1 year later in 1991, he would create his magnum opus. In the 1980s, German climber Milan Sikora began bolting a new route on what he described as a massive boulder. This 50-foot chunk of limestone was covered in small pockets and razor-sharp crimps, and try as he might, Milan was unable to make any real progress on it. So in 1991, he called his good friend Wolfgang Gulich and unleashed the beast. Over the course of 3 weeks, Wolfgang and the rock battled it out, the seemingly impossible climb appearing more possible by the day. And this battle would personify the age-old question: what happens when an unstoppable Wolfgang meets an immovable object? He climbs over it. On September 14th, 1991, Wolfgang completed his send of what is now one of the most iconic climbs in the world, Action Direct, the world's first 514D. This climb would go on to become a benchmark for the grade, and a milestone for any sport climber worth their salt, with notable sends by many prolific climbers such as Ondra, Stefano Ghisolfi, and Saeed Belhaj. Also, according to Wikipedia, which is where I get all the research for my videos, Wolfgang said he named the route Action Direct after the French terrorist organization, as climbing it felt like an attack on the fingers, which is pretty funny. At this point, Wolfgang Gulich was rightfully regarded as the greatest rock climber of all time. He had now established 4 new grades in the sport of rock climbing, accomplished the hardest free solo ever sent, and claimed the first ascent of 2 major big wall climbs. He went on to be Sylvester Stallone's stunt double in the 1993 film Cliffhanger, which they filmed in 1992, where he continued to showcase his unparalleled strength and finesse on the rock wall. But things would come to a tragic end on August 29, 1992, when Wolfgang fell asleep behind the wheel of his vehicle while driving on the Autobahn and crashed. He died 2 days later in the hospital. And while Wolfgang's life was tragically cut short, he did more and accomplished more by the age of 30 than most people do in a lifetime. This entire video, everything we've talked about Wolfgang up to this point, happened over the course of 10 years. It really makes you think about your 20s and just how important those years really are and how much you can truly accomplish. Like if I died right now, people would be like, oh my God, what was his legacy? What did he accomplish in his 20s? You'd be like, he was really good at Gears of War. Nevertheless, Wolfgang's death sent shockwaves through the climbing community, and it would take an entire decade for someone to finally establish a new grade in the post-Wolfgang era. In 2001, Chris Sharma would send Realization, the world's first 515A. Chris would be the first climber since Wolfgang to hold the mantle of greatest climber. Although it's important to note that Alexander Huber's send of Open Air in 1996 was later upgraded to 515A by Adam Ondra, making it the actual first of the grade. This is important, we'll come back to it later. In 2008, Chris Sharma would strike again by sending Jumbo Love, which would become the world's first 515B. And it would only take 4 years for the child prodigy Adam Ondra to send the first ever 515C change. Although in later years, some have speculated that it's actually closer to 515B. Looking at you, Seb. Either way, it doesn't actually matter because Adam Ondra would also go on to send the second 515C, La Dura Dura. And of course, in 2017, Adam would go on to send Silence, the world's first 515D. And now you're all caught up on the history of sport climbing grades and the legacy of Wolfgang Gulich, but we still have to talk about my conspiracy theory. After researching this video, I took the liberty to make this graph here using Photoshop, which, don't ever use Photoshop to make graphs, it fucking sucks. But as you can see, Wolfgang had such a profound effect on sport climbing grades and pushed them so high that it took years for other climbers to catch up to him. But what I really want to talk about is Adam Ondra. I'm going to say the most controversial thing any rock climber has ever said, right? I might potentially blacklist myself from the entire rock climbing community. Are you ready? I don't think that Silence is actually 515D. There it is.
Wow, that was so anticlimactic.
It has been over 7 years since Adam Ondra sent Silence and has yet to be repeated. Even Stefano Ghisolfi, who's been going around sending every 515C that even sneezes in his direction, has not been able to send Silence. And this is where what I said earlier comes into play. Sometimes a climber will send something at a certain grade, and then years later, somebody will repeat it, realize it was harder, and it was actually the first ascent of the next grade up. And I think that's what happened here. I think that in reality, Adam Ondra's send of Silence in 2017 was actually the first send of a 516A. And we won't know for sure until other 516As are established and somebody goes back and repeats Silence and realizes it's actually as hard as the other 516As. 6 out of the 17 sends that we covered in this video were initially graded lower and then pushed up to the next grade later when somebody repeated it, becoming the first ascent of that grade. So it's not uncommon at all for this to happen, and the likelihood that Silence is a 516A is basically like 1 in 3. And another interesting thing about this would be that would mean that Seb Bowen's send of DNA in 2022 is actually the first 515D in history. So that's my conspiracy theory. Let me know what you guys think. I get most of my information from Wikipedia, so if it's incorrect, blame Wikipedia. But also, if any of you guys out there do want to be the first ones to climb a 516A, make sure you're hangboarding, all right? Click the link in the description and get a hangboard, get a doorway mount, get 20% off a hangboard when you buy a doorway mount. Man, I really fucked that whole thing up. I'll see you guys later.